Hi, welcome to the Shepherd's Rest Doc Talk. This is a special Passover edition, part 2.
We will be looking at Torah portion. The reading for this week is
Exodus
13, 17 to 15, 26. What? Last week was 12. Okay, so what we're looking at now is what's happening after the Passover, after we've had the lamb and the offering or slaughtering of it and the eating of it, and they take off on the 15th of Aviv, which is now what we call Nisan,
right
after Babylon. And so now we're looking at what's happening in the rest of the week during the Feast of Matzah, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. What's going on? What's the significance? This is the journey of them leaving the land and being birthed as a nation, coming through the Red Sea.
And you know what's interesting is through that, they're being chased.
Yes.
They're being chased by Pharaoh and everyone else. I don't know, I just think that's significant.
It is.
When we think about our wilderness experience.
Well, even when you put it on a bigger scale, you have an event of 7 days. All right, 7 days that they've left, they're being chased. And then once they go through that birthing process, like going through the mother's womb, the water breaks, and they come out on the other side as a full nation, as a full body, that is the idea of going into the 8th day. It's the same idea. Now let's take days and put it into millenniums. Right? We've got the 7,000, and then we go into the new beginning, the 8th day.
Right.
The new, or the eternity, the world to come. So we have a lot of these parallels in this week. But one thing I wanted to talk about, and we did a short little thing on it, but that is, I love how the very beginning of this, when there seems to be the fact of, oh my gosh, here we go, we're being chased and all these negative things are happening, the Lord in 13:17 definitely sets the pattern of, look, I'm not going to give you something more than you can handle. Yes. You're not going to go that direction because you won't be able to handle it. So even as they're going through all the seems like terrible things through Numbers, or not terrible things, but challenges, every one of them, they're presented with the Lord knowing that they can respond properly.
All right, so here's my thought on that. You know how so many times we have an issue or we have a problem and we just want to pray it away. Yeah. We just want the Lord to deliver us right then. And we don't understand. We think it's our faith that's lacking if He doesn't deliver us right then. But sometimes a delivery will give us more than we can handle.
A whole new baby.
Yeah, well, it gives us too much. So the Lord has to bring us through this wilderness process before He can bring us into the land.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, it is true that sometimes I think the mentality, it's the 21st century and some of the 20th century's mentality of, I can pray it away, it needs to just go away. It's all what I need to do, you know.
And I know best.
Yeah,
obviously I know best,
and that's to tell dangerous. God to do. Yeah, and you know, on the idea of not just letting those problems be done away with. Look, we have them here in chapter 13 where they are being delivered, and the first place they go isn't hightailing it out; it's to Sukkot to get Joseph's bones. Right. Now, what do we have? We have an empty tomb. We have a tomb where Joseph's bones are no longer there.
Right,
and leaving Egypt.
Yeah.
So I love this because it really does follow the pattern, obviously, of what's going on during this Passover week as they're going through redemption. Another thing I want to say is, if you notice in this week's reading portion, and even heavily in chapter 15 where it's talking about the Song of Moses, it didn't just happen like this, just like coming out of Egypt. Well, you know, while Yeshua died on the cross and it is finished, that's the heavenly aspect. Right. But the earthly aspect is not finished. That's why Hebrews 8 talks about it's, you know, those garments, the skies of heaven are slowly disappearing to be made new. They are not just done.
Right.
It's a process. And I remember this was a year or two ago. It was really the Passover process that I came to understand. This is a process. Scripture, salvation is all a process, which is why it's so important how we end. Right. And we see that even with the journey. It's all important on how we end.
And we talked about this in one of our fun facts, Isaiah 9, where it talks about His government being the increase of his government,
yes.
right? And it's a closed mem, meaning that it's closed up for now. You know, his government isn't here. It's the promise that we're looking for. It's our hope. You know, the work out your salvation daily with fear and trembling. That is the hope, knowing we will eventually get there.
That's a great point. Because if it was all already done, then we really don't have a hope. We don't have anything to look forward to.
This is it, guys.
Right, this is it. And we know that's not the case.
Right.
So truly, the hope is, as you just said, knowing what is to come.
Right.
Meaning it can't all be done yet.
Right.
How cool is that?
So it's not finished.
Right.
Not the earthly part.
Not the earthly part, right. Another thing I saw was, it's kind of a link, but it's 13:21, and it's talking about how the Lord went before them by day as a column of cloud, and then by night as a column of fire. But you know, we see in Exodus 19:4, where he talks about giving them wings of the eagle to move.
Wings.
Yeah, eagle's wings to move. Mm-hmm. Now think about this. We have in 15 where they're going across, and 14 they're going across. That's a lot of people to move. A lot. I started realizing, gosh, you know,
like
I really see this, right, like, move along. You know, I don't know if anyone ever read, or if you read the book Left Behind, and it's one of the millennium. Anyway, it's like people are walking on a conveyor belt, and they're just like exponentially getting there. That's how I see this when the Lord says he carries them on eagle's wings. There's something happening there way beyond what we understand. They're not drudging like it's been 7 days. You know what I mean? The Lord is carrying them. There's some kind of eagle's wings. There's something
supernatural
going on.
Movement.
Absolutely.
Not so much a rapture, but like, how did we do that?
Right, exactly.
How did that happen?
Only God can get glory for that. It wasn't
Right.
they just were all, you know, became mighty men. It's the Lord carried them. And if they became that strong, it's because the Lord strengthened them, which is another great point. We have where Pharaoh was being strengthened. Mm-hmm. We have in 13:3, where it talks about in the middle of verses, for by the strength of the hand of the Lord for by the strength of the hand of Yahweh brought you out of this place, and whatever is leavened you shall not eat. Well, the point is, it's strengthened. It's the Lord's hand. We see in Daniel him also speaking of Daniel talking to an angelic, and the angelic reminds him, look, you can't strengthen yourself. Only the Lord's going to strengthen you. Mm-hmm. Only the Lord is going to provide that. So here we have Israel being strengthened. We have all the players on the board being strengthened.
Yeah.
And we often look at how Pharaoh was strengthened by the hardening of his heart, strengthening of his heart, but we don't really look at how Israel was strengthened. Because remember, they're hearing all the yelling, and they're being called out, and they're going. I mean, they're not bringing a lot of food. There's just a lot of factors there that absolutely scream the testimony of the Lord's hand of bringing them as if on eagle's wings.
Right. You know, there's always two sides of a coin. Mm-hmm. So as one's being strengthened, the other is being strengthened, but it's going to look completely different.
Opposite ways. Yeah.
That's happening today.
Oh, absolutely believe that. Yeah. I see it more and more. This year I just saw it even more, and I'm sure next year we'll see it even more. That gulf is becoming greater.
It's true.
Between truth and lies, between, clarity and deception. And I've been so drawn to 2 Thessalonians 2. There's just so much information in there that we've so many years had it tangled up with just meaning a rapture. But when we hook it back to what's happening here in Egypt, we realize restrainer is Pharaoh. We realize that we've got all these other
players,
that are physically bound here on earth happening. It makes it really much more of a reflection of the time in Egypt and this Exodus,
right?
Than it does
the first Exodus.
The first Exodus, right? Than it does of just a sudden evaporation.
Yeah, we out of here.
Yeah. But anyway, I'm going for whatever. I'm hanging out, going, Lord, you say it, I'm there. But we just don't want to be silly and not be prepared to do the part that we are called to do.
Right. And something you said about this was, even if there was some kind of a supernatural bringing them out for those 7 days, that stopped once he got them where he needed them to be.
Right. Once they hit Mount Sinai.
And then they had to overcome themselves.
Yes.
I was thinking about this yesterday. I was on my way home, and I thought about all of the things that had plagued me, spiritual things that had plagued me for really my whole life that I don't deal with anymore.
Right.
But the scariest part of that is now I seem to be dealing with myself. And that is scarier than anything, because how comforting it is sometimes to say the devil made me do it. When you know it's a spiritual problem, even though you hate it, it's almost comforting to say, well, I mean, what can I do about it?
Right.
But
and
when
now,
it's just yourself to overcome, you realize just how much you need the Lord.
And really and honestly,
His grace.
It's always the flesh. When Messiah says, to die as he died, that's dying to the flesh. Because remember, when we do that, we cling to the Lord. And by clinging, Hasatan cannot be near.
Right.
But you're right. The flesh part is what just, again, it's what they're dealing with. And I love how you said that. Once they got past, they get to Mount Sinai, what did he give them? He gave them the Torah. He gave them the instructions on how to draw near so the enemy could flee.
Right. And the instruction is so you know what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong. It's that mirror aspect.
Yes.
And then, like you said, it's because nowhere in the Torah do you see Hasatan coming against them. Mm-mm. You don't see it anywhere. No. Because this is
They're
really
dealing with themselves.
A pattern of what we deal with spiritually. Once the Lord delivers us from the hand of the enemy, we have to overcome ourselves. And it's all through obedience.
Two more quick things. One of them you will find in Exodus 14:25. I never saw it this way until Sunday night. So it's talking about... it says, and he, the Lord, took off their chariot wheels so that they drove them with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for Yahweh fights for them against the Egyptians. So in my head, and I'm sure because it was a Sunday school story, I've still got that stuff in there.
Right.
They're driving in like their wheels get hard, but they're still driving after Israel. They're still going. Yet, when you read this, their wheels get harder and they say, let us flee opposite direction. Mm-hmm. So suddenly I was like, wait a minute. They're going after them just fine. And then the Lord makes it hard. But it's more like they're trying to get away.
Right.
When they decide, wait, we need to get out of here, they can't flee. The Lord doesn't slow them down chasing. The Lord slows them down once they realize who they're really up against. He lets them on their own come to the full understanding of the power of the true living God before he destroys them. Again, exactly what we're going to see in the end. He's going to let the nations come to their full understanding of who he is before they're destroyed.
Oh, so at the end of the millennium.
Yes.
Not at the beginning.
No, but we'll have a double shot, but definitely at the end. Right. Absolutely. So,
yes, I know there's a lot going
Revelation
into
20.
the millennium, but what you're talking about here, they never had to deal with Egypt again.
Right.
So think about that. When we get to the point where we never have to deal with Egypt, the world again, is at the very end.
Right. And then we go into the eternity, just like Israel's going to go into the land. There's the land, and then there's New Jerusalem, which brings us, that is eternity.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Kind of cool stuff. Yeah. Okay, and then the last point was my thought about this process of deliverance, and actually goes to the end. I thought, so we have the Passover deliverance, which is the 7 days from being brought out and then going through the Red Sea, right? Mm-hmm. And brought to Sinai. That's a 7-day event. And then I started thinking, and then we also have through Messiah, we have the spiritual, which is the 3-day event. He goes into the grave and then he's brought out.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. But according to Hosea 6, I think it's 1 and 2, it's going to be a 1-day event. There's the 2 days, and then in 1 day, he's going to cleanse and make us righteous.
Right.
So we had the physical, that was 7. We had the spiritual, that's 3. And I would suggest in the very end, we have the 1, that is the physical and the spiritual together.
Oh, like the day of the Lord you're talking about? The one?
Right. When he comes and does those things, the day of the Lord. Now, just for the record, the day of the Lord is actually not 1 24-hour period. It is probably 1,000-year period, 998 years.
A lot of things are happening
in
the day.
Just like the 40 years in the desert is not really 40 years that they wandered. They really only wandered for 38, but we call it 40 because their whole journey was 40 years.
Right.
Same thing, the day of the Lord will be an entire 1,000-year, but of that 1,000-year, 900 and something of the actual, that's going on, right? Learning or whatever that process is. So anyhow, so that was just my last thought. How we have 7, 3, 1, all very scriptural, biblically heavy and packed numbers.
They are. When you start to really examine the 7, the 3, and the 1, it's all over the place.
Yeah, and especially in the event of them leaving Egypt and the plagues. We've got the 3s and the 7s and 1s.
Yeah. All right, there is one more thing that I want to talk about.
Yes.
And that is from the Brit Hadashah in Acts 20, verse 6 and 7. I'm just going to read it. It's talking about Paul here, and it says, "And we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and came to them at Troas in 5 days, where we stayed 7 days." Here's your 7. "And on day 1 of the week, the taught ones having gathered together to break bread, Paul, intending to depart the next day, was reasoning with them and was extending the word till midnight." All right, so growing up, I've always been taught that this proves that the disciples, all the way back in Yeshua's time, had changed the day of worship to Sunday. But I just want to bring this up because here we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right, first. Right. Then they traveled. Then it says on day 1 of the week. Now, when you go to the original Greek, that day 1 of the week is actually Mia Sabbaton. And Mia means one or first. And it doesn't mean one like, one of those pencils over there or one of those pens. It means one as in like the only one, like the very first one.
Right.
And so if we read that in conjunction with unleavened bread, we see that they were teaching and reasoning the scriptures on the first Sabbath. And we know from Leviticus 23 that is our command, is to count 7 Sabbaths from first fruits.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Yes. That. Which is, so this would be the very first Sabbath after they started counting. So when you know Torah and you read things like this, going back to the Greek, what was meant to kind of prove a twisting of the scripture, you really find you can untwist it because Torah, if your mind is set that Torah is relevant.
Right. Towards the tracks.
Right. Then you will read that and go, wait a minute, something's off here.
Yeah.
Then you start to really research it and you realize, no wonder. I mean, it's just been completely distorted, so to speak, because the translators already had it in their mind that it was okay to change it to Sunday.
Right.
So they just assumed, because see, it proves right here they're teaching on Sunday.
Yeah.
But really, it was this coming up weekend, it was the first Sabbath.
Right. Which is, it's just so awesome how, again, this is a great example of we'll know the end from the beginning.
That's right.
You've got to have them together.
And it also proves that they were still adhering to Torah. And of course, that's why we still keep the feast now, because we want to look like our Messiah. And years ago, I'm sorry, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. Years ago, I had this word from the Lord and he said that he was going to raise up a generation. He was about to raise up a generation. I think this was like 2007, maybe 6. It was a long time ago. He was going to raise up a generation that wasn't afraid to really find out who he was, wasn't afraid to really dig in, and they were going to look like the first century church. Now, of course, with the limited amount of education that I had at the time and knowledge, I thought, we're going to do all these miracles and all this power and all this, because that's what I was surrounded by, constantly hearing about the power that's coming. Yeah. But when I really look at it, it's like, so we're going to look like the early church because they still looked like Messiah, who still looked like Israel. Right. Yeah. So I just thought that was an interesting little nugget.
It's how those layers just come off, and then you're like, that's not, it's still beautiful. It's just not what I thought.
Right. And I heard several people say the same thing, that the Lord showed them or told them that we were going to go back to the first century church, and they took it the same way, power. Yeah. But what I'm really coming to understand is that's just not it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a different type of power.
Yes.
Again, we define power by man-made rules instead of scriptural rules.
That's right.
Cool stuff.
Yes. All right, well, that's all we have for you today. Thank you so much for joining us for this special edition part 2. And we will be back next week with the regular Torah portion.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Well, we hope you have a fantastic week. Shalom.